business ethics has become a big business in its own right. It's grown from a fringe issue that some small-time alternative CEOs might mention in passing, to a corporate staple that has its own course in 90% of the business schools in America. Major companies now mix in ethical initiatives with their earnings reports, and there are even dedicated research centers focused on studying how companies can solve all of the world's problems with some combination of acronyms. DEI, CSR, ESG, TBL, whatever your favorite is, they are all guidelines for how the world's most powerful companies can look out for something other than their own free cash flow. So then, why the fuck is this the second worst idea in business history?
Every day that my dad came to work, he came home and he was happy and he was fulfilled.
If it is about serving as many people as possible, then the right place is born.
We are looking at how we are training and giving leadership development and making coaching available from the very best to every one of our distributors.
Corporate social responsibility, or ethical business, whatever you want to call it should be an easy idea to sell. You probably don't like it when companies pollute your home, take your money with deceptive practices, or lobby your government to spend your tax money on their bailouts. But operating ethically in business often comes at the expense of acting profitably. And company leadership, who answers exclusively to their shareholders, will be forced into picking profits over ethics. Corporate social responsibility, therefore, is all about showing company managers, their boards, and their shareholders that there is a way that everybody can win, and that ethics and profit don't have to be at odds with one another. The message of the double bottom line is catching on. It now has some big-name supporters like Klaus Schwab, the chairman of the World Economic Forum, who literally wrote a book on stakeholder capitalism. The World Economic Forum is a controversial organization best known for an annual meeting where the world's rich and powerful meet up in the Swiss Alps to talk about how the world ought to be run. Stakeholder capitalism has been one of their big initiatives, and in theory, it doesn't actually sound like a bad idea. It basically says that instead of companies looking after their shareholders, they should look after all of their stakeholders, which in addition to their investors also includes their employees, their suppliers, customers, and society at large. The idea of getting companies to be on their best behavior is not just lip service either. There is now some serious money behind it. According to Bloomberg, investment funds that specifically invest in ethical companies now hold over $7 trillion in assets under management. But there are 3 reasons why corporate social responsibility, or whatever you want to call it, is the second worst business idea in history. It's bad for employees, it's bad for shareholders, and worst of all, it's bad for everybody else. The first reason is that it puts all of the power into all of the wrong hands. If you put a tiger in a petting zoo for a kid's 3rd birthday party, it's not the tiger's fault that there is no 4th birthday. It's the fault of the adults that should have known to put the proper restrictions in place to make sure that the tiger couldn't feast on little Timmy. This does not dismiss or forgive the bad actions of companies. If you are subscribed to our other channel, you will know that history is littered with companies committing actual crimes against humanity in the name of maximizing profit. But it should not be their job to decide for themselves what is right or wrong. And least of all, should it be up to them to enforce ethical standards. That is the job of real lawmakers, real courts, and real authorities. Initiatives like ESG investing, industry-standard corporate governance controls, and yes, stakeholder capitalism have been used to lobby against official government regulation that could actually hold bad actors accountable. Companies have said that instead of the real authorities with some teeth regulating them, they will regulate themselves, and they pinky promise that this will be a win-win for everybody. The tiger has promised that it's gone vegetarian. And there are no need for those electric fences that the zookeepers were thinking of installing anymore. Companies like Shell, BP, Exxon, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Monsanto, Nestle, and worst of all, EA, all have pages and publications dedicated to talking about their ethical standards, corporate diversity, and environmental controls. Researchers at Columbia University and the London School of Economics compared the ESG records of US companies and ESG funds to non-ESG companies. They found that the companies in the ESG portfolios actually had worse compliance records for both labor and environmental rules. Their ethical efforts were mostly performative to get regulators to look the other way. Even when these companies do get caught doing stuff that's not only unethical but downright illegal, the image of corporate ethics is still valuable. A report by The Economist found that firms that had been convicted of bribery in the US under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act received more lenient fines if they had been seen to be actively engaging in comprehensive CSR practices. Instead of being a major shakeup to their operations, companies took the threat of regulation and turned it into a marketing campaign and an investment opportunity. According to a market report by PwC, ESG funds have been some of the fastest growing investment tools in history. Bloomberg Intelligence estimates that environmental, social, and governance-derived investments will be worth $40 trillion by 2030 and represent a quarter of all financial assets under management. That's not bad for an initiative designed to dissuade overzealous regulators. It's understandable that investors would like their money going towards companies that are, at the very least, trying to do the right thing. But unfortunately, not many people really understand how these investments work, or how they could actually be making these problems a lot worse. So it's time to learn how money works to find out why corporate ethics is the second worst idea in business history. Swapping out real regulations with real consequences for self-governance would be okay if it worked. But ESG and other brands of corporate ethics have shown too often to be worse than literally doing nothing at all. If you invest into an ESG fund, what you are really doing is buying a slice of lots of companies that a fund maker like Vanguard, BlackRock, or a smaller investment manager has decided meets their ESG or corporate ethics criteria. The idea is that by directing your investment money towards these companies, they can grow faster and outcompete companies that are behaving unethically or damaging the environment. The problem is that a lot of the most popular funds don't really work like this at all. A report from the Harvard Business Review found that some of the most popular funds with a corporate ethics or environmental thesis actually had a larger weighting of fossil fuel companies than just a broad market index. BlackRock's U.S. Carbon Readiness Transition Exchange Traded Fund sounds like an investment into a pool of companies improving battery technology, building renewable power stations, or making electric vehicles. Right? Wrong. What this fund actually does is invest into companies that BlackRock believes will be the best positioned to benefit from the transition to a low-carbon economy. Oil companies are heavily weighted in the fund because they will benefit from more expensive energy prices and government subsidies during any transition. So this supposedly ethical investment opportunity is not so much encouraging a transition as much as it's trying to profit from it while letting the investment manager that put it together charge a higher fee than they would be able to charge for a regular passive index fund. Other funds are slightly less misleading towards their well-intentioned investors and will try to invest into companies doing good, but even that has major problems. There are three methods for building these ethical funds: the active, the inclusion, and the exclusion method. An active fund will have a team of analysts picking which companies they believe will do well based on an investment criteria, in this case, good ethical credentials. Actively managed funds charge higher fees because they have to cover the large salaries of market researchers who decide what stocks to buy and what stocks to sell at what time. After accounting for these fees, most actively managed funds underperform the market, so they are becoming less popular with investors. The inclusion method requires a little bit less effort from the fund manager. These funds work by filling an index with companies that are in ethical industries or doing things that people consider ethical behavior, like having a benchmark of diversity on their board or in senior management positions. You may not personally consider criteria like the diversity of board members worth investing in, but there are thousands of different funds, all with different ethical criteria. The exclusion method is the most passive of all. It will just take an existing fund and kick out particularly bad companies. The problem with all of these methods is that it can be very hard to build a diverse portfolio of ethical companies, so they lower their standards or pick the least bad option. Exxon and Shell are both oil and gas companies, but maybe Shell built a few more windmills or purchased more carbon credits, so they would be included in a fund that wanted to be ethical but wants exposure to energy more. Even that wouldn't be so bad if these investments still did well, but they don't. Some investors don't really care about how ethical the companies they invest in are. They just think that ESG investing will still outperform the market as a general trend towards more accountable business takes place. The market for these funds is still new, and maybe there is a long-term benefit of how these ethical companies operate, but unfortunately, ethically constructed funds have consistently underperformed the market. But this all ignores the biggest, dumbest issue of all with corporate ethics. Your idea of what is ethical may be very different from mine, and that's okay. Where some people might see environmental destruction, you might see the most affordable fuel source that could heat people's homes and power industries that put food on the table for millions of people. Creating a hard and fast template for what counts as ethical and then rewarding companies that pretend to adhere to it hasn't been good for investors, it hasn't been good for society, but it hasn't even been good for the companies either. Performative ethical measures are often unaffordable to small businesses. If investors and customers are exclusively seeking out businesses that can afford to hire teams to ensure their quality for ethical recognition, then smaller businesses without those resources will be less competitive with larger companies that are normally less ethical in reality anyway. Bill Gurley, a venture capitalist who invests into early startups for a living, has said that regulations overwhelmingly favor incumbent businesses because they are the only ones that can afford to make sure they are compliant, and that applies to self-regulation as well. Gurley is a venture capitalist, so he is financially motivated to make it easier for small businesses to grow. But that doesn't mean he's wrong. Even to large companies that can mask over their ruthless profit motive with ads about how sustainable they are, it's still an expense that doesn't really achieve much. but will ultimately be passed along to their customers. The Nobel laureate economist Milton Friedman argued that this was basically an invisible tax placed on customers and shareholders who may not even personally agree with the brand ethics that companies are self-governing with. Even in cases where corporate social responsibility is not just a marketing exercise, the personal ethics of the corporate executives that are making the framework are likely to be very different than the stakeholders they are working for. A wealthy executive might, for example, prioritize environmental initiatives over increasing worker compensation because to them, that seems like a more important issue. The real solution to all of this is to let regulators regulate. Businesses seek profit, and for the people to decide what businesses should and should not be doing. Companies are under a lot of pressure from investors and customers to reduce their environmental footprint. Carbon offsets were an easy solution that for a while kept stakeholders happy. Unfortunately for the companies patting themselves on the back for their ESG efforts, people eventually realized that these offsets achieved nothing. Major investors have lost hundreds of millions of dollars in just the last week, and now a multi-billion-dollar speculative market that you weren't supposed to know about is imploding.
A Dutch court says Shell must reduce its CO2 emissions by 45% by the year 2030.
But environmental groups are really skeptical. They argue that offsetting now can simply be a way for the wealthy to avoid or delay taking the necessary steps to reduce their use of fossil fuels.
We issued $5.75 billion in sustainability bonds, the largest by any company in history.
Anytime you see a company promoting a product as carbon neutral, it got that status by buying a security off an unregulated financial market. If a clothing brand like Gucci emits 1 ton of carbon to produce its hideous pair of flip-flops, they can buy a 1-ton carbon credit to offset their emissions and market their shoes as carbon neutral. There are 2 major non-profit organizations that dominate the market for these credits: Verra, headquartered in DC, and Gold Standard, headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. These organizations do not remove any carbon themselves. They audit other companies or projects like carbon sequestration, forestry, and agriculture. If you own a company that can prove to Verra or Gold Standard that you have removed a ton of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or prevented it from being released in the first place, you can get given a verified carbon credit. Verra and Gold Standard both have an application and verification process for companies that want to start receiving verified carbon units. Verra charges an application fee and a verification fee, and a fee of 10 cents for every carbon unit awarded, with a discount applied to companies that are issued with over 1 million carbon units in a calendar year. If you owned a company that was reducing carbon emissions in a way that you could verify with these organizations, it's worth paying these fees because you can then take your carbon unit and sell it at a markup to a company like Gucci so they can sell their flip-flops as carbon neutral. This entire process is separate from the legally required cap and trade programs like ones enforced here in California and in the European Union. But if this is entirely voluntary, why the fuck are companies paying millions of dollars every year to buy these credits? Well, there are 3 reasons, and none of them are because these companies really care about the environment, although that's what they would like you to think. It's not even for marketing. A survey conducted by the Harvard Business Review found that 65% of respondents said that they would want to buy from purpose-driven brands that advocate sustainability, but only 26% actually did. If you have ever seen a carbon-neutral logo while doing your shopping and acted on it, well done. But most people are not like you. The 3 real reasons companies are spending billions of these voluntary credits are the same reasons that the whole system is now falling apart. The first reason companies are actually doing this is because it lets them take advantage of new investment trends. ESG stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance, and it has been a popular investing practice since 2008, when a lot of companies were criticized for immoral conduct. Investors wanted to put their money into companies with good ethics for 2 reasons. The first reason was because they thought they could generate better returns. Companies in environmentally friendly fields looked like the future, and if the companies that collapsed in the mortgage crisis had better governance, they might have survived in the first place. The second reason was because people wanted to pat themselves on the back for doing a good thing by only supporting companies that were ethical. Unfortunately, it is questionable at best if these well-intentioned investors achieved either of these goals. In the beginning, ESG investing required people to individually pick their stocks and research the company's financial and operational credentials as well as their ESG performance. It was time-consuming, and individual stock picking is very risky. The trend took off when asset managers like BlackRock and Vanguard introduced mutual funds and index funds with their own ESG certifications. This led investors to buy one diversified group of shares out of the box that was already certified ESG compliant, although that really had no official meaning. The role of senior company leadership is to maximize returns for their shareholders. That is their legal and fiduciary duty, and, more importantly, how they secure their annual performance bonuses. Every boardroom in America saw this trend, and they knew that if they got their company listed on an ESG index, it would boost their share price because more potential investors would buy their stock. Getting into these ESG indices was surprisingly easy. ESG funds were made using either the inclusion method or the emission method. The inclusion method was much more rigorous. Fund managers would go through companies one by one and only accept businesses doing outstanding work to benefit the environment. The problem with this method is that it wasn't very well diversified. If you bought into such a fund, you would be overexposed to electric cars and renewable energy companies, which are highly speculative. A more popular method was the emission method, which took an existing index like BlackRock's IVV S&P 500 index and kicked out the bad actors like tobacco, gambling, and weapons companies. These funds still wanted diversity in their asset base, so they let these companies back in if they could prove that they were better than other companies in the same industry. And the easiest way that companies found to get past the ESG bouncer was to offer carbon-neutral products. And that's how companies like Royal Dutch Shell, Exxon, and Nestle made it into the ESG funds, but Tesla was excluded from them. You don't have to like Musk, but it's hard to argue that the company that made electric cars mainstream is a worse ESG candidate than the world's largest oil companies.
Suspicious, very suspicious.
The performance of ESG funds was initially promising, although that had a lot to do with the investors rushing into the space rather than business fundamentals. In a recent Journal of Finance paper, University of Chicago researchers analyzed the Morningstar sustainability ratings of more than 20,000 mutual funds representing over $8 trillion of investor savings. Although the highest rated funds in terms of sustainability certainly attracted more capital than the lowest rated funds, none of the high sustainability funds outperformed any of the lowest rated funds. The actual power that companies like BlackRock and Vanguard have over the companies they invest in on behalf of their clients is usually overstated, but even they have started pulling back on ESG initiatives. If buying carbon credits to be carbon neutral isn't going to make a company any more attractive to these groups of investors, then they aren't going to waste the money on a voluntary expense that, according to some studies, actually does more harm than good. The companies that make carbon credits, the company that use carbon credits, and the nonprofits that regulate this voluntary market are not the only players in this game. The market for carbon credits became so large that hedge funds started trading carbon credits in unregulated private markets. The price of carbon credits varies depending on how many projects are producing the credits by taking carbon out of the atmosphere and how many companies are buying the credits to make their products carbon neutral. Trading firms like the Trafigura Group moved into this market and attempted to profit by speculating on these price fluctuations. Unfortunately for them, they have now lost a significant amount of money because the value of voluntary carbon credits has fallen from a high of $19 in January of 2022 to $1.77 in September of 2023. A loss of more than 90% in 18 months. And that's because of the second reason this market became so popular to begin with. It slowed down regulation. There are other markets for carbon credits that are not voluntary. The largest of such is the European carbon credit market. Companies in the European Union have a cap on the amount of carbon they are allowed to emit, and once they go over that cap, they need to buy carbon credits for every ton they are over. The price of a metric ton of carbon in the EU is currently around $82, which is 50 times the price of a ton of carbon in the voluntary markets. The price of carbon credits in the European markets has been increasing at the same time as the price of carbon in the voluntary markets has been crashing. The reason that the voluntary markets were so popular to begin with was that companies liked the idea of self-regulating. If they could prove to the public that they could go carbon neutral with voluntary carbon offsets that cost $19 a ton, it is less likely that they would need to buy mandatory carbon credits for $80 a ton. Going carbon neutral by choice was cheaper, and it let companies run PR to investors and customers about their green initiatives. Some of these claims sounded too good to be true, and that's because they were. The third reason this multi-billion-dollar market is collapsing is because the whole scheme never worked in the first place. According to a study led by Cambridge University on 40 Verra-approved projects, as much as 94% of the carbon credits sold never actually removed any carbon from the atmosphere, but they still let companies claim their high-emissions products were carbon neutral. So how the f*** did they get away with this? The organizations like Verra creating carbon credits are non-profits, but they still need to make money to keep their operations going and further their mission. These organizations do not take donations. They make all of their money from the various fees projects have to pay to register carbon credits, so they have an incentive to allow as many to be created as possible. According to ProPublica and the company's own filings, Verra generated $40.5 million in revenue in 2021 and had assets worth a total of $50.5 million. They also paid their CEO a total compensation of $370,000. When you hear carbon removal, you probably think of projects like this one, big machines that literally suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. That's what they would like you to think, but most carbon credits had nothing to do with machines like this and were instead created in rainforests. The cheapest, and therefore most popular way to produce voluntary carbon credits was to buy tracts of land in the Amazon for preservation. The trees not logged were accepted by Verra as carbon that won't be released into the atmosphere, so they qualified for carbon credits. Preventing deforestation is a great cause, but the Cambridge report revealed that most of the land set aside for preservation was never going to be logged anyway because it was too remote and difficult to get to, which is why it was cheap to begin with. Because this land was useless for any company, it was very cheap, so it became the most popular way to generate carbon credits. Following this report, Verra's CEO that had run the carbon credit certifier for 15 years resigned. In a press statement, the nonprofit said his sudden departure was made for unrelated reasons. The bombshell report has attracted the attention of regulators, which are now cracking down on the carbon-neutral branding. Investors and customers trusted these certifications and changed their investing and purchasing habits around them, believing they would do some good. This put less pressure on businesses to pursue real solutions that actually would have a positive impact on net emissions.
And I'm a fan of carbon offsets in the sense that they can help mitigate climate change. They absolutely can. But, if we're not going to do it correctly, in a way that actually does help mitigate climate change, then it's nothing but a distraction.
The trading firms that were holding on to these carbon credits with the long-term vision that they would become more valuable in the future have had to write them off as completely worthless because companies are no longer interested in buying them. In an interview with Bloomberg, the head of carbon trading at Trafigura, the largest carbon credit trader in the world, said that the complete loss in value in some corners of the voluntary carbon credit market is unlike anything she's witnessed. Now that Verra and Gold Standard have put new restrictions in place to define what counts as an offset, a new registry opened in the Middle East to hand out offset certifications to companies that don't care and just want to put carbon-neutral stickers on the stuff they sell. The fourth reason that this market is collapsing is because companies have realized there are more effective ways to lobby against regulation. Corporate America has become obsessed with company culture, but those Friday afternoon drinks and team building days are papering over a terrible trend which is making your workplace miserable and stalling your career.
I really mean the entire Apple team. I can go out in a retail store and the retail teams.
Together, we can finally put people at the center of our technology.
Operating in a clean, fast-paced, friendly environment. A team full of people just like you.
Company culture is one of the biggest trends in corporate management. Small companies with as few as 20 employees are hiring culture managers whose full-time job is to promote a collaborative and positive work environment. These are full-time employees that, from a bottom-line business perspective, do nothing but make the other 19 employees more engaged with their work.
Culture is what keeps people around.
According to a survey of job seekers and hiring managers conducted by Robert Half, a workforce analytics firm, 91% of managers said that a candidate's fit with the organizational culture was more important than their skills and experience. Hilariously, a PwC survey on company culture found that 69% of companies believed that their culture gave them a competitive edge. Presumably, the other 31% of companies realized that an office didn't need a ping pong table and kombucha on tap to be a nice place to work. Managing corporate culture is expensive. Corporate culture managers are earning an average salary package of $110,000 a year according to Glassdoor. Direct salary expenses also don't capture the additional costs of running culture events and the lost man hours in the name of team building. It's a big investment and one that is not paying off. Most workers report only engaging in workplace team activities because they felt they had to. They said that they would rather spend their hours at work focus on their job tasks and after-work hours with family and friends or catching up on personal errands.
None of us at work like it when some person in HR comes and says, "Hey guys, we're doing this fun activity from X time to X time, and you had no say in the matter, but you have to go." And I think we can all agree that this is terrible.
Even when activities were funded by the company, most workers said that they did not enjoy what they called corporate prescribed mandatory fun. An article in the Harvard Business Review found that these types of business environments were one of the main reasons that top-performing employees left the business. So, why the company still obsessed with their culture if it's so expensive to maintain and only makes employees want to quit? Well, there are actually 4 reasons, and each one is worse than the last. The first reason is that companies don't want to create a company culture. They want to create a company cult. Management at large companies has discovered that they can build an undue level of control over their employees if they control their thinking and behavior in the workplace. Senior management will push the narrative that the company stands for something greater than generating an acceptable rate of return to its shareholders.
But that's exactly what it is. It's a business of people serving people. And it was, is, and always will be about the culture of the company.
Startups are prone to do this with overly enthusiastic founders that think they are going to change the world. But the Harvard Business Review found again that cult-like behaviors were most common in the largest companies. Apple, Tesla, Nordstrom, and Harley-Davidson were the examples their report gave. Ritualistic behavior is a common characteristic of cults and companies that take their culture too far.
We have a lot of companies that really brag about their culture. It's on their website. There's even one company in town, I won't mention their name, but will pay their employees $2,000 if they tattoo sort of the company culture on their bodies. Not a joke. $2,000.
It is still mandatory for Walmart employees to recite the company cheer once a day in all of their stores around the country. According to the company, Sam Walton, the company's founder, toured a Korean tennis ball factory in 1975 that started every day with a company chant. Walton, who was obsessed with Asian business culture, liked the idea so much that he made it mandatory in all of his stores. One thing that attracted Walton to businesses in the East was the utter devotion that employees have for their company and its founders. Employees routinely put in twice their salaried hours to impress rigid corporate leadership, a trend that business owners back in America were keen to replicate. Sam Walton's daily chant may be a cup full of concentrated cringe, but other companies take it a step further by employing another tactic of cults: language control. When employees start working at Disney theme parks, they are given a language guide.
When you get a job with the Walt Disney Company, it's not just getting a job, it's like entering a new community.
I would have already been fired because there are no employees at Disney parks. There are only cast members, and there are no customers, only guests. And employees are not at work, they are on stage. Employees are reprimanded from going off script. Disney knows that controlling the language their employees use will get them to put in extra effort around their parks. Disney is not alone. Google employees call themselves Googlers, unless they have just joined, and then they are Nooglers. Amazon employees are Amazonians, and Facebook employees are Metamates. It sounds harmless, and some people might even call it good management, but it's still mental conditioning with an objective. What's even scarier is that it works. I'm sure that you can think of a lot of jargon terms and acronyms unique to your company. Language and rituals are a big part of any culture, but in corporatism, their aim is to get employees to think of the company and their job as something bigger than just a place they go to do tasks to earn money.
For folks who want to be part of something bigger than themselves.
A workforce that thinks their company is more important than the compensation that it provides will accept lower salaries and remain more loyal than they would to a company that doesn't pull the same tricks. Google's corporate culture is legendary for free salad bars and encouraging creativity, but that's only in place to get Googlers to stay in the office longer and share their best ideas with a trillion-dollar company. Goldman Sachs' culture is to be home of the smartest, hardest-working people that want to get paid more than everyone else for being better than everyone else. But that culture lets them work their new analysts 80 hours a week a month straight because they know the culture they were signing up for. If corporate culture is starting to sound less like an annoying business buzzword and more like a horrifying trend, that was only the first reason of 4. The second reason that companies have become so obsessed with their culture is because pushback over workplace issues has become a lot more serious. Offices have become a lot more diverse and inclusive, and public opinion has shifted to support groups that previously would have been marginalized. This is positive progress, but it's not without challenges. When everybody in an office has a similar background, it's easier to avoid faux pas that will get the company in trouble. In a modern office, what is just a joke to one person will be an attack to another person.
Really uncomfortable, man. Whoa, Kayla! Slow down, Speedy. I can't wait to see us in my bedroom later.
If you got time, why don't you swing by my bedroom, huh? We'll see whose you can get done first.
Mine's bigger.
Stop.
Mine's bigger.
You boys are gonna stretch me thin.
Okay, what the f? This is literally sexual harassment, okay? Like, how are you okay with this, Kayla?
I'm remodeling Rob's bedroom later. When I'm not here, I run a small interior design company.
The court of public opinion is very unkind to companies no matter how they handle these situations. Having a strong cultural framework in place can help reduce the chances of these events happening. Stopping bad PR and getting the most work out of the widest possible pool of talent is all the companies really care about, but that sounds too dehumanizing, so they brand it as corporate culture and everybody is happy. A company that makes a big deal about its corporate culture can also use it as a defense when problems do eventually occur. Any corporate apology is bound to include a line about how the company takes workplace culture very seriously, and it holds its people to the highest standards of whatever. This isn't a bad thing. A workplace should be somewhere everybody feels comfortable, even if it's a little more rigid than the 1950s-style Mad Men ad firm. But don't be fooled into thinking it's been done for the right reasons. A culture is only good as how much extra profit it can make for a company every year. The third reason that companies have become so obsessed with corporate culture is because everybody else is doing it and they've all convinced each other it's important. Corporate culture has been a concept in business management since the 1970s, but it has only become a buzzword in the last 10 years. The obsession with company culture began when company leaders saw the success of tech startups, and they had a very different way of doing business, but were becoming the most valuable businesses in the world. The push for positive company culture really became about chasing what worked for others. The objective of creating the best possible working environment got lost to following trends and fads that were implemented poorly.
And now the new thing in Silicon Valley, they use this a lot, which is like, I like to hire people that I want to go have a beer with. It's like, well, that's a really stupid reason to hire someone.
Office cubicles were once the definition of a depressing work environment, but now they look like heaven. Anybody that has worked in a culture-centric, collaboration-focused, open-plan office knows that it really means that you'll be working shoulder to shoulder with your coworkers on a small desk barely big enough for all of your stuff.
This is where I work. My desk is incredibly close to my poor neighbors. I always have to wear headphones to concentrate, and nobody ever talks.
The old office cubicles were better for workers, but moving to the conveniently cheaper option of cramming more staff into the same square footage can be justified by management with a focus on promoting company culture.
Open offices are about saving money.
The extra space is used for rec rooms that look great on the company's career landing page, but workers will get into trouble for using if they don't meet their performance objectives. In the age of culture obsession, a team isn't a group of overworked people who drink heavily to cope with stress. They just work hard, play hard. The employees share blame in this obsession as well. One of the most frequently recommended interview questions for applicants is to ask about company culture. 91% of hiring managers rank a good cultural fit over the applicant with the best skills, so this is good advice. But the interviewers then need a good answer. If they said that they are a boring company that sets reasonable expectation for their workers and realizes that their accounting department is not a fast-paced and dynamic environment, it would put off a lot of LinkedIn enthusiasts. The best strategy for both workers and employers is to play along with the game and pretend they care. Company culture can be good for everybody, but not if it goes too far, and it can actually hurt company and career success in 3 ways. The first problem is that it can recreate an environment where everybody is the same, even if individualism is what it was trying to promote. Sometimes good ideas are had when not everybody feels 100% comfortable, and if everybody is too in line with the homogenous culture, there won't be anybody to challenge bad ideas. Companies with strong cultures can also isolate new employees and make them feel very awkward. I am sure you have all talked to someone that was just a little bit too into their company.
And just love my job.
Now imagine working with a whole team of them. It is also a lot of pressure. Most of the stuff you do at your job does not matter. If you file a report late or enter some date wrong, it won't be the end of the world. But if you and all of the people you work with believe that the company is more important than just something that pays your bills, then every little mistake becomes the end of the world. This is terrible for the mental health of employees, but it's also terrible for the company because it disincentivizes free thinking and controlled risk-taking. If companies that go woke actually do go broke, it could be $1 billion investment opportunity that all the biggest hedge funds in the world are ignoring.
There are no consequences for going super woke in terms of trying to appeal to the far left wing in this country. And then Bud Light puts out this, remember it was a March Madness advertisement, and it just keeps getting worse and worse.
You know, we showed it to you yesterday, and it was Pepsi's controversial commercial that starred Kendall Jenner. And the ad even caught the attention of Martin Luther King Jr.'s daughter, Bernice. She tweeted this photo, "If only Daddy would have known about the power of Pepsi."
Companies going woke is the trend of their communications, products, and advertising materials, aligning their brand with progressive or liberal values and ideas. People who have noticed these trends have also noticed that companies perform worse financially after these branding changes. As a brand manager, alienating a share of your customer base with advertising materials and tweets that contradict their beliefs is not a good move, especially when they are highly invested in the issue. It's now common to see customer backlash and product boycotts over ideological issues like Anheuser-Busch's now infamous Bud Light partnership with Dylan Mulvaney. The paid Instagram and TikTok posts from their activists promoting the beer sparked backlash from conservatives who boycotted the brand in protest. In a desperate attempt to win those customers back, Anheuser-Busch's CEO in an earnings call meeting said this:
"We need to continue to clarify the facts, that this was one can, one influencer, one post, and not a campaign.
And repeat this message for some time. This attempt to distance themselves from the controversial marketing campaign backfired when progressive customers also started boycotting the product.
Really prided ourselves in working with brands that like to support the LGBTQ plus community more than just putting rainbows on cans.
This was a rare case where a brand was too woke and simultaneously not woke enough. But it did show that customers would be lost from both sides of the political aisle.
On the one side, the more conservative community is annoyed about the sponsorship. On the other side, the LGBTQ community is annoyed because Bud Light didn't come back and rally behind and take a stand one way or the other.
So this video should really be called, "Do brands that pick sides on divisive issues lose market share?" But that doesn't rhyme, so I'm sticking with my choice. Since the post was first made, Bud Light sales slumped 23% in May compared to sales the year before, costing Anheuser-Busch roughly $60 million in just 31 days. Bud lost those sales to competitors like Miller Lite, Coors Light, and Modelo Especial, which overtook Bud Light as America's best-selling beer in the very same month. Customers are also becoming more aware of social messaging from companies. So even if advertising is in line with your beliefs, you can still respond negatively to it because it comes off as pandering by a company that only wants your money. But if companies actually do exist exclusively to maximize returns of their shareholders, and ideologically aligned decisions like this can have such enormous financial consequences, then why the f don't brands just shut the f up and stop making their products a political statement? Well, there are 3 reasons why companies seem to be making this terrible mistake, and 3 reasons why investing based on wokeness is a terrible idea. The first reason that companies seem to be making these terrible PR mistakes is their failure to adapt their marketing to new platforms that allow for unpredictable audience engagement, both good and bad. User-generated social media and content platforms have become an important tool in any direct-to-consumer marketer's arsenal. Marketing through official online advertising platforms like Google AdSense or Meta's Facebook ads is significantly cheaper on a pay-per-view basis than legacy advertising channels like television, radio, or newspapers. Online advertising can also be done by riding on the back of exposure given to influencers on similar platforms through paid posts. The reason that Bud Light paid Dylan Mulvaney to promote their product is because they had 11.5 million followers across Instagram and TikTok, so their product would be seen by a lot of potential customers. Both forms of online advertising have the benefit of being able to directly call customers to action by providing a link to a website where they can sign up for a service or make a direct purchase. Advertising through influencers has the additional feature of aligning a brand with an inbuilt audience that has an inherent level of trust in the person selling the product themselves. Endorsements of bad companies can be highly damaging to an audience, particularly when they are watching an influencer for advice on a particular subject. To brands, that trust is an asset, and it lets them select their audience less indiscriminately than if they were advertising through legacy advertising channels. The Bud Light marketing executives that greenlit the Dylan Mulvaney campaign certainly knew that the campaign would clash with a large share of their customer base, but they probably expected that those customers would not be looking at these videos in the first place. Product executives use market segmentation based on geographic, demographic, behavioral, and psychographic divisions all the time. The best marketing campaigns can promote a product to 2 opposing groups without alienating either. When Apple advertises its iPhone to children and young creatives, they focus on its cameras, the App Store, and exclusive blue text boxes so the customer's friends know they are part of the crowd. When Apple advertises the same product to white-collar professionals that the young hip crowd wants nothing to do with, they focus on data security, reliability, and compatibility with other business tools. The example of Apple has much lower stakes because nobody is going to boycott the iPhone just because it appeals to the opposing group. But the company still has to be careful about where it places its adverts so it doesn't waste its marketing budget. When companies take a bigger swing on a more controversial topic, it can go horribly wrong if marketers target the wrong market with the wrong message. Procter & Gamble, the makers of Gillette razors, launched the Best a Man Can Be advertising campaign in early 2019. The short film showcased scenes of men demonstrating negative behavior, such as bullying, sexism, and toxic masculinity. The messaging was overwhelmingly received negatively by the company's target audience, which was men, even though it received praise from groups that were not in the market for men's grooming products.
Whenever you take a stand, you always risk losing a few people. And if nothing else, they're going to be buzzed about, they're going to be talked about, this is going to get a lot of attention, and that's always good for a brand.
That's what happens when marketers pick their wrong audience. But the viral nature of internet messaging can make it hard to control who sees a message. When advertising through influencers, marketers have less control over segmentation, because any post or video can go viral and get the attention of the part of their customer base that they didn't want to see it. Under normal circumstances, the Bud Light post would have just been shared to the influencer supportive audience, Anheuser-Busch would have sold some beer to a new group of customers, and everybody would have quickly forgotten about it. And that's the first reason why trading on the go woke, go broke investment philosophy is not going to work. This one example ended badly for the brand, but there's no way to reliably predict which missteps are going to go viral and which ones are going to be ignored.
Like, respond to the things that are meaningful for you, not because it's a great marketing moment, but because it's real, because you actually believe it.
Even the Bud Light incident, which is probably the most serious case of customer backlash against an advertising campaign, only resulted in a 15% stock drop. A large movement, but still well within the usual trading volatility of the company. Even if you were able to accurately predict the next major marketing fail, your gains could be wiped out by normal market movements. But that's just short-term speculation. The real play is to find companies that have changed their entire product offering to pander to one group at the expense of the wider audience, and there are plenty of companies doing this too. The second reason that companies pick sides on divisive issues is because it works, but just not for the companies. There are companies that go beyond altering just their advertising and actually change their entire business offering to cater to a particular market segment. This involves changing not just marketing strategies, but also product offerings and hiring practices as well. Even if hiring based on identifiable features is illegal in America and most other countries, there are easy ways around these rules that companies can use to their advantage. Disney is frequently called out for putting a heavy emphasis on progressive messaging in their films and TV shows, and for casting actors and actresses based on race or identity. The company now has declining viewership in its largest franchises, Marvel and Lucasfilm, and their live-action remakes of legacy films. Ideological issues are also the basis for the company's disputes with the governor of Florida, the state home to Disney World and the Disney Cruise Lines. The mistake here is thinking that a company with over 180,000 employees can always stay aligned on issues. Hollywood has a progressive culture, and studio executives can eschew responsibility for bad decisions by saying an audience didn't like a movie because their bias is towards a particular group. Staying in line with the culture of Hollywood also makes securing talent easier for big studios. A big-name actor or director will reliably bring in more viewers than are lost by making sure they can put their spin on the production. Ideological hiring is also a great excuse for companies looking to get the cheapest possible talent. The tragic recent story of the Ocean Gate Company and their Titan submarine exposed some unfortunate corporate decisions made by the company and its founder Stockton Rush. One that's coming under a lot of scrutiny in hindsight was the company's decision to only hire young free-thinking engineers because they, quote, didn't want to hire 50-year-old white guys to pilot and engineer their sub.
Gentlemen who were ex-military submariners, and you'll see a whole bunch of 50-year-old white guys. I wanted our team to be younger, to be inspirational, and I'm not going to inspire a 16-year-old to go pursue marine technology.
It's very difficult for a career professional to defend 50-year-old white guys without attracting labels that could hurt their career, and so the practice of woke hiring can continue unabated. The reality of this company and others like FTX, Theranos, and WeWork is that they wanted employees that were cheap to hire and overwork, or employees that didn't have the experience to point out shortcomings in the company's operations. Since poorly managed companies can't say they are doing that, they instead say they have a young and disruptive workforce, which makes them almost impossible to criticize without being called a hater or worse. It's not good for the company, but it is good for the decision makers who need to avoid being fired or exposed for their ineffective management. The problem with betting against these companies is markets can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. If you believe that Disney changed its product offerings to be more socially progressive at the expense of quality, when would you have entered a short position? Disney's stock is down 60% from its all-time high in 2021, but it's up from when it supposedly went woke. Analysts unanimously agree that recent declines have mostly been caused by problems with the company's streaming services, company leadership changes, and declining viewership. That third factor could be the result of wokeness, but the conclusion of major franchise series is more likely to blame. Confirmation bias is very important to consider when doing any type of investing. Disney's stock drop can easily affirm any belief that investors have about weaknesses in the company when it was really more likely just coming off an exceptional rally. The third reason that companies do this is that if they get it right, it does result in higher sales, brand loyalty, and staff retention. The best way you can combat confirmation bias is to intentionally seek out information that disproves your theory. A report by the Chartered Institute of Marketing, an article by Rolling Stone, and a survey of ESG-listed companies found that businesses with strong social alignment with a customer segment outperform companies that remained neutral. Keurig, United Airlines, Carhartt, and Chick-fil-A have all taken strong positions on divisive topics, and yet they are still performing well despite calls from different groups to boycott their product. Keurig acquired Dr. Pepper Snapple in 2018 for $18.7 billion. forming Keurig Dr. Pepper Incorporated, which is now the third largest beverage company in America. The company's annual gross profits have increased ever since, reaching $7.3 billion in 2022, a nearly 5% increase from the previous year, which outperformed the industry standard. In 2021, United Airlines planned for half of its incoming pilot trainees to be women and/or people of color. This prompted calls for boycotts, but United later reported fourth quarter 2022 profits of $843 million, beating investor expectations. Chick-fil-A has been very open about the company's conservative values, which has caused opposing groups to call for boycotts, but Chick-fil-A is still outperforming in the highly competitive fast food market. If companies get these messages completely wrong, it can hurt their brand, but it's shown to be a bet worth making. A handful of angry customers will typically be outweighed by positive press. Unfavorable examples can always be picked out. Some were just bad ideas, but most had more serious issues that social messaging was just a cover for. Good investing is about accounting for long-term trends, which means unfortunately, cringy corporate messaging is not going anywhere. But there is one more thing that you should consider, and that's ignoring the performance of companies that never even pretend to be the good guys. Ethical investing has become incredibly popular in recent years. The promise of being able to put your money towards businesses that don't harm the environment, exploit vulnerable workers, or engage in bad business practices is obviously very attractive. The idea of this practice is that by denying these bad companies access to investments, they won't have the opportunity to grow and continue their harmful practices. Some big names in the investment space have also backed up an ethical investment strategy by saying that not only will it do good for the world, but it will also do good for your wallet, because it can offer higher returns than a traditional investment strategy. The problem is that it almost certainly can't. Ethical investing may feel good, but under the surface, it effectively rebrands one of the biggest mistakes that people are making when getting into investing: not being diversified. What's more is that ethical investing might not actually have the positive effect on the world that you might initially expect from listening to the thought leaders in this space. Alright, so before I start ripping into ethical investing, it's important to understand how it actually works. When investors are talking about ethical investing, they are most often talking about ethical investment management funds or ethical index funds. Popular examples of which include Chamath Palihapitiya's Social Capital, as well as a large selection of publicly traded indices from companies like BlackRock and Vanguard. Now, actively managed funds have their own problems. Multiple studies have shown that after management fees, only a teeny tiny percent of them consistently outperform the market, so already they are not off to a great start. But to keep things fair, I want to park those type of investment companies to the side for this video and just focus on the ethical index funds. These are far more likely to be used by regular investors, and they also make up a far larger share of the market. We are also going to ignore the associated fees on these funds, which are normally substantially higher for the ethically branded variants. So trust me, I really am going to give them a fair go here. But with that out of the way, the first thing you need to know is how these index funds are made. Well, like all index funds, ethical indices are made up of tiny slices of lots of different securities. These thin slices will then be bundled up into an index and sold off to regular investors as a totally new security with inbuilt diversification. This is amazing for most investors because diversification is so important when building out a portfolio, but it can also be prohibitively expensive. To buy a capitalization-weighted share for every stock on the S&P 500 would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some individual shares themselves can be worth more than the average person's entire portfolio, so index funds like the SPY are a much more suitable alternative. Ethical index funds work basically the same way, but they only let ethical slices into their index pie. There are two ways that they can do this: the omission method and the inclusion method. The omission method is the most common, and it involves investment companies starting with a base index of lots of companies and then kicking out companies that operate in certain industries, perhaps fossil fuels and tobacco companies. This works well, but there are inevitably some bad players that will fall through the cracks. Nestle is a snack company, so it wouldn't be omitted from this index despite not exactly being what you might call a shining beacon of moral virtue. This is where the inclusion method is preferable. This is where investment companies will individually pick and choose companies that adhere to their ethical framework. Generally speaking, inclusion funds will be filled with companies that are really trying to make the world a better place, and omission funds will mostly be filled with companies that aren't completely terrible. So now that you know what goes into creating these funds, you might think this still sounds pretty good. And that's why it's time to learn about two big reasons why they are not. The savvy investors amongst you may have already picked up on the first major problem when looking at how these funds were made, which is that by one means or another, there is some system actively selecting stocks. The more you pick and choose your stocks, the less diversification you will naturally have, which is a really bad thing. To demonstrate why, consider a casino filled with lots of tables all offering various games. For the sake of this example, let's say that on average these games have a house edge of 10%, which means that for every $1 you put into a game, you are expected to make just 90 cents back. To keep it even more simple, imagine one of those games is a simple flip of a coin. If you lose the flip, you give up any money that you bet on that hand. If you win the flip, then you win $1.80, maintaining the 10% house edge. Obviously, this is unfair, but it's effectively how all gambling works. It's normally just a little bit less obvious. Okay, so as a player, how many flips of a coin would you bet on to maximize your expected return? The correct answer is none. Or if you are forced to, you want to be on as little as possible. If you bet on one flip, sure, you might lose it all then and there, but you have at least a 50% chance of making some money. Statistically speaking, it only goes downhill from there. If you don't believe me, I have linked a Monte Carlo simulator in the video description, so feel free to play around with it. Alright, now let's flip this example on its head. What if you were the casino manager? How many games would you want people to play to maximize your potential return? You would want them to play as many as possible. A player that comes in and drops a bucket of money on a single hand is actually very scary to a casino, because that player has almost a 50-50 chance of walking away with double their money. If a player instead decides to split their money up and play over 50 hands, they are almost guaranteed to lose that money. This is why if you ever go to Vegas, you will notice that most card games have table limits to spread out people's gameplay and give the odds time to do their thing. Now, replace casino with stock market. The American stock market has historically returned around 10% per year, so that means that if you are an investor, you are in the fortunate position of having the house edge. Of course, you could put all your money on a single hand or a single stock and generate massive returns in a very short period of time, but with the house edge, you are, statistically speaking, better off spreading out your money as much as possible to let the odds do their thing. Now, this makes a few assumptions. You could have insider knowledge or be a card counter, but both of those strategies are going to get you kicked out of their respective examples very quickly. What this means for our ethical ETFs is that they are intentionally foregoing the inherent benefit that comes with playing as many hands as possible. And what's worse is that they are often omitting entire games altogether. Let's say that tomorrow, large lithium-ion batteries are shown to give people cancer. This would be devastating for electric vehicle companies, but it would probably be great for the fossil fuel industry. In theory, a well-diversified portfolio would have exposure to both of these industries, and the losses in the former would be mitigated by the gains in the latter. If you were only exposed to the more ethical industry, you would feel all this pain directly. You may personally believe that ethical businesses are the future, and I hope you are right, but that is a belief, it's a speculation, and good investors don't speculate. Alright, now what if you have taken all of this on board and are still happy to deal with a slightly lower return in order to do your part for the good of humanity? Well, there still is a better way, because beyond everything else, ethical investing probably doesn't do much good at all. Almost every stock that is purchased to make up these ethical funds will be purchased from the secondary market. That is, shareholders that already own the stock and are now selling it, rather than the company itself. That means that money invested into Tesla isn't going to fund new electric cars more than money invested into BP is going towards setting the world on fire. The money is just going to the random investor that owned the shares before you. Now, there is one counterexample that ethical proponents will use to dismiss this critique, which is that company managers have an obligation to maximize shareholder value. If their morally tainted shares become so unpopular that the value tanks, then the management will be forced to change up operations or risk being thrown out by the board. This idea is nice in theory, but here is what will actually happen. Let's say an investment fund decides to go ethical and dumps all of their oil and natural gas holdings. The price of these shares take a beating after the sell-off, but they now represent a better value to morally indifferent investors. If this happens enough, then sure, the share value of a company might plummet, but that only makes it more popular amongst buy and hold investors who might start getting a 5, 10, or even 15% dividend on their newly discounted stock purchase. This increased earnings per share will drive demand and counteract the effect of the ethical sell-off in the first place. For better or worse, people engage in the stock market to make profits. Going in there with an ulterior motive, however noble it may be, is going to put you at a big disadvantage. If you really do feel passionately about these issues, that's fantastic. Honestly, I am right there with you. But ethical investing is just not the right way of going about pushing change. You would be far better off investing wisely and using your extra profits to donate towards the causes you believe in, or even purchasing products from companies that you believe are doing good. Ethical investing might give you the warm fuzzies, and I'm sure there are going to be millions of comments in the comments section talking about how XYZ index returned 20% last year, but that's all missing the point. If you want to invest wisely, you need to respect the statistics. One index generating great returns over a year or two is no different from a gambler on a lucky winning streak. If you want to invest your money, invest well. If you want your money to do good for the world, spend it in ways that do good for the world. Don't become an ethical investor and expect to be the saint of Wall Street, because that's just not the way it works. Now, if you want to learn about another type of scheme promising to mix financial gain with moral virtue, go and watch my video on the dark secret behind those Amaze giveaways you have likely seen sponsored all over YouTube.